So for our new unit, for section 1, we're going to start by talking about the Renaissance, which is a really important time period following the Middle Ages. So with the Renaissance, we want to start by talking about kind of the basics. What was it? How did it come about, etc. So the first thing that you need to know is that the term Renaissance is a term that means rebirth. And the reason that they use this term rebirth is because it was almost kind of a revival of sorts of culture in the past that they appreciated. So make sure that you fill in for Renaissance means rebirth. And then we're going to talk about kind of what this time period was. So the time period itself runs from the 1300s to the 1600s, 1300s to the 1600s. And it was a period of change in philosophy, art, literature, architecture, and culture in Europe. So this time period focused on more of the artistic styles and cultural styles and things that were happening in Europe in this time period. Now, the other thing you want to note about this time period was that this time period was viewed as a revival. Of many of the classical styles. Of Greek and Roman times. So they very much had an appreciation for the art, the architecture, the literature that was kind of gave way in the times of Greek and Roman times to this new movement here in the 1300s. So the Renaissance started in Italy. That's where the main Renaissance is that we were going to discuss. And it impacted solely the wealthy people of Italy. So it impacted the upper classes. And I would make a little note that the upper classes were only a very small portion of the population, about 10% of the population at that time. So when we're talking about the Renaissance and the impact it had on society, relatively of that time period, only a very few number of people were impacted by these events. However, they still mark a substantial change in culture during this time period. And the Renaissance occurred due to really the Crusades was one of the big reasons why we saw this time period come about. So the Renaissance occurred due to the increased wealth from trade following the Crusades. And then I'd put a little semicolon. And we want to say that many wealthy trading families like the Medicis, which their name's up there on the screen for you, like the Medicis, began to invest their money into art. So we see the wealth that came from the Crusades. If you remember, we talked about how Italy was one of the major trading ports during that time period of the Crusades, they take that money and they invest in kind of these art movements, because now they can fund things that wouldn't normally be able to be financed in that time period. So that kind of gives birth to the Renaissance. Now, at that time period, there's also some other things that are happening within European society that are going to spur the Renaissance occurring. So for EQ2, we're going to talk about some of those changes that allowed for this to happen. So the first thing that we want to note is that feudalism ended. Feudalism ended as a result of the Crusades and the Black Death. We talked about both of those events in the Middle Ages, how they more or less caused the end of feudalism. So many societies were now under the control of a central monarch or king. Or under the control of a central monarch or king. So now we see kind of unification under one individual since the feudal system is gone. So that change is going to allow for a kind of more streamlined approach to government and economics and things during this time period. So that's one change that's going to kind of transition into the Renaissance. The other thing that is especially important in Italy that allowed for this change is that Italian society was broken into distinct social classes. Distinct, D-I-S-T-I-N-C-T, distinct social classes based on wealth and political power. Based on wealth and political power. So we see that Italian society becomes very much kind of diversified, where the socioeconomic status of individuals, those that are of those upper classes, oftentimes have more access to money and political power and land and all of those things of that time period that were considered important and affluent. So because of that, what we see is that the upper classes, so this is our last bullet, the upper classes develop a new sense of elevated values. Develop a new sense of elevated values, which included secularism, humanism, and rationalism. Secularism, humanism, and rationalism. So we're going to talk about those three things now, how those values very much kind of supported Renaissance society during this time period and a lot of the changes that we see. So for EQ3, we're going to talk about this term humanism, which kind of encompasses the other two. So we first want to start by defining what humanism was. So humanism was a philosophy that stressed the importance of the individual. And challenged people to think for themselves, experiment, and create. So this concept of humanism was a way of thinking where it wanted people to start to kind of push the limits of just accepting what everyone told them, to start to kind of think outside the box and be creative and challenge the norm. And so this is one of the main philosophies of this time that is going to support the new kind of creative art movement of the Renaissance, as well as other movements to develop as well. So one of the main proponents of humanism was this guy named Petrarch. And Petrarch was considered kind of the main leader of what we would call the humanist movement. And so Petrarch kind of pushed for these ideas of humanism, of encouraging people to, challenge the traditional way of doing things and be creative and all that kind of stuff. And one of the big things he pushed for was what he called the humanist education. We talked about how education was still relatively limited at that time period. But with humanism, it wanted to try and open the door for more individuals to have access to education and kind of change the way education was traditionally done. So with a humanist education, two of the things that he presented was first that the humanist education was what we call more secular. That term is up on the screen for you, more secular. And the term secular means not religious. So I would put after secular in parentheses non-religious or not religious. So if you remember, we talked about how traditionally education was provided solely by the monks and the members of the church. So Petrarch and other humanist leaders are saying that education should actually not contain anything about religion or eliminate the concept of religion and its influence on education. So that's one major change, and that's something that was very influential to our education that we receive here in public education. And then the other thing was that we want to say, and focused on liberal studies. And focused on liberal studies. And liberal studies includes many of the classes that you take today. So I would maybe list some of these in parentheses after. Liberal studies includes things like history, literature, speech, music, and art. So a lot of the different skills and classes that you have today are what are considered to be liberal studies. So we can kind of see how education has been very heavily influenced by this humanist thinking and humanist philosophy. And so what we see happen is that people during this time period, they develop a greater appreciation for learning and education, which would influence the need for technology to fuel learning. Which is going to be one of the innovations of this time period we're going to be talking about here in just a second, which was the printing press. So I would maybe in parentheses or after that write printing press. The last thing we want to note about this humanist movement, I told you how this was very important to influencing the Renaissance and how people acted and behaved and the idea of creating art and architecture in this time period. But humanism also is going to contribute to two other movements we're going to be talking about a little bit later. Those two movements were the Scientific Revolution and what we called the Enlightenment. Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. And those are both movements that got people thinking about life around them very differently. Scientific revolution, obviously thinking about scientific innovations as well as, astronomy, mathematics, chemistry, things like that of the time. And the Enlightenment got people thinking more about kind of government and economics and religion and all those different types of things. So pushing people to think differently about those different topics in that time. And we'll look at that more closely in our next unit. So now what you're going to do is you are going to open up the article on Canvas about the printing press. The article is pictured right there for you. Now you're going to read the 3 pages with the article, and you are going to complete the graphic organizer for EQ4 that is on the reverse of this page of notes. When you are finished taking the notes from the resource, you're going to bring your notes up to me and show them to me, and I will check them off on your chart. So your completion chart that I gave you at the beginning of class. Then what you're going to do is grab a paper square from the small cabinet. You're going to put your name at the top, and you are going to answer the discussion prompt that is on the board, written on the board there by the bulletin board, and complete your response to that. When you're finished with the paper square and the prompt, you'll turn the prompt into me. I'll sign off on your checklist, and you will complete the next part, which will have you listening to part 2 of section 1. Do this now.